When you think of Saudi Arabia today, a country that's not even 100 years old, you're probably picturing something like this. But only a few decades ago, this is what the country actually looked like. This country has gone through a transformation that's unheard of in just a few short years. They've gone from a land of nomadic, disparate tribes to one of the richest, most influential giants in the global stage. Today, they control over $1.4 trillion in wealth and oversee 17% of the world's petroleum reserves. But here's what's shocking. One of the reasons behind the massive growth of Saudi Arabia can be attributed to none other than the Rockefellers. October 2nd, 2018 seemed like any other day for Jamal Khashoggi, until it wasn't. The journalist was known for criticizing the Saudi leadership and was living in exile. On that day, he entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul to collect documents for his wedding, but then he was never seen again. Turkish officials soon revealed that he had been killed and dismembered. The Saudi government denied it for weeks, before later admitting that he was indeed killed. However, the kill order didn't come from the top. Now, whether you believe this sequence of events or not, it is undeniable that Saudi Arabia has an immense amount of influence and power globally, so much so that an explosive story like Khashoggi's leaves those at the top relatively unscathed. But the origins of this kind of power goes back to a time before oil was even in the dreams of the Saud family. You see, a deal was made in the deserts of Arabia hundreds of years ago that is just as relevant today as it was then. In 1744, Muhammad bin Saud met with Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. One was a ruler and the other was a religious leader. Now, Wahhab preached a return to purist Islam, but his ideas needed force to spread. Muhammad bin Saud wanted to expand his territory, but he needed a cause that would rally his people. So, they made a pact. Wahhab would provide religious legitimacy and the Al Saud family would lead the charge. Together with faith and force, they began expanding their control. But then in 1818, the Ottoman forces crushed their rule and forced them into exile. But losing power was never the end of the Al Saud family. Only 6 years later, they returned and reclaimed their homeland. Despite overcoming external threats, internal succession disputes threatened their future. But that is until Abdul Aziz bin Saud emerged as a leader with a vision. In 1902, he stormed Riyadh and drove out his rivals, and one victory just led to another. By 1913, he had the entire Gulf Coast as his domain. By 1925, the holy city of Mecca was his, and by 1932, he stood as the undisputed king over a land that had been divided for centuries. Now, Abdul Aziz expanded his rule not only through war, but also through marriage. He married daughters from powerful tribes and respected clerical families. To keep his newly unified land from falling apart, he created ties that kept the kingdom stable. With 45 sons and at least 22 wives, he built a royal bloodline that has led Saudi Arabia ever since. But while these internal ties were crucial, Saudi Arabia knew that it needed external alliances to secure its future. You see, Saudi Arabia always understood that alliances were important, but they remained cautious of European ambitions. The kingdom needed a partner that could really back its long-term vision and help shape its future. So, it turned to the United States, who introduced it to Standard Oil. Standard Oil was the legacy of a monopoly that was created by John D. Rockefeller himself. And it is this partnership that would reshape the kingdom and the world's future. You see, before tying relations with the US, Saudi's future was not defined by oil. Instead, the kingdom's foundation rested on centuries-old traditions. Before oil, Saudi Arabia was a poor and isolated backwater. The land was harsh and its economy was barely surviving. People were mainly nomads and they lived off the land raising camels, sheep, and goats. Agriculture was limited and focused mostly on local needs. There were no industries, no major experts, and no real wealth to speak of. The kingdom's economy was simple, self-sufficient, and deeply connected to the land and its customs. For generations, Saudi Arabia's economy was primarily supported by the revenue from pilgrimages. Every year, millions of dedicated Muslims from every corner of the world dutifully made their way to Mecca. and their arrival consistently provided crucial support to the kingdom's economy. But everything changed in 1933. That year, a monumental agreement was signed between Saudi Arabia and the Standard Oil Company of California. Rockefeller himself was long gone by then, but the influence of his legacy companies was very much real. This partnership led to the creation of Aramco and set the stage of the kingdom's transformation. When signing the deal, the Saud family would have hoped that the deal would make them rich, and of course it did. But the sheer scale of their modern wealth is beyond anything anyone could have ever imagined. You see, the word luxury has a completely different meaning when it comes to the Saudi royals, because luxury means palaces filled with golden furniture, super yachts, and private jets. And if that wasn't enough, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman casually dropped $450 million on a single painting. It's literally the most expensive painting ever sold. And the Saudi prince's $300 million chateau in France is a perfect symbol of the family's limitless wealth. While wealth is concentrated at the top, many ordinary Saudis actually struggle. I mean, simply put, Saudi Arabia's royals are worth billions, but critics claim that millions of ordinary Saudis are not nearly as well off. King Abdullah actually pumps billions of dollars into welfare programs, but again, many critics say that it's not enough. Despite spending huge amounts of welfare, those critics argue that the donations are probably more about maintaining the country's image rather than actually solving the problem. You see, Saudi Arabia takes their image very seriously. For instance, in 2011, there are claims that 3 video bloggers ended up behind bars for making a film about poverty in the country. I mean, no doubt that Saudi Arabia is one of the richest countries in the world, but not everyone is living the high life. Between 2 and 4 million native Saudis are surviving on less than $530 a month, but again, there's almost no official data on poverty. So let's roll the tape back a little bit. Where exactly did the country get to its level of opulence and wealth, at least at the very top? This is how it all started. One drill, one strike. And in an instant, an entire country was transformed. It was March 3rd, 1938, and deep in the sands of Dhahran, an American oil well struck something massive. I mean, this moment didn't only change the future of Arabia, it reshaped the world's energy future. Beneath Saudi Arabia lay the largest petroleum reserve the world had ever seen. Rockefeller hadn't survived to see this, having died just 1 year before this. But his legacy companies were looking better and better by the day. Soon, the Saudis began constructing vital infrastructure needed to tap into this newfound treasure. Roads, pipelines, entire cities were being built from the ground up. The once empty desert had been transformed into a kingdom. By 1939, Saudi oil reached the world, first in small flows and then in torrents. And then their fortune took a massive turn. War happened. But during World War II, no one could ignore Saudi Arabia's strategic location. It sat at the crossroads of the world between oceans, empires, and battlefronts. I mean, the West saw its importance immediately. The US moved in and set up a critical air base in Dhahran, a coastal city near the Persian Gulf. The base gave the US a foothold in the Middle East and effective control over vital trade routes from Asia to Europe. Now, when the war ended, another challenge appeared, and that was energy. You see, the US actually needed more oil than ever. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia was stepping into a new global order. It had oil, but it needed security. Americans poured into Saudi Arabia. Engineers, oil executives, military advisors all came for the same reason, to secure the oil supply. But in return, the Saudi students and officials traveled to the US, a world of modern industry and rising global influence. I mean, on the surface, it looked like a win-win. The US got access to the world's most valuable oil fields, and Saudi Arabia got expertise and a steady flow of wealth. The US-Saudi alliance transformed oil into rivers of wealth. But this caused some serious internal tensions with their original allies, the Wahhabists. You see, while the partnership modernized Saudi infrastructure, the money flowing into the royal coffers caused some really uncomfortable questions for Saudi Arabia. You see, not everything about the House of Saud's rise had been smooth. Behind Saudi Arabia's wealth and global reach, there's a darker side. For instance, Islam emphasizes simplicity and warns against wasteful consumption. But in Saudi Arabia, the lifestyle of the royals was telling a different story. Take Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, for example, and his lifestyle. I mean, it's relatively normal for royals to have shows of wealth, but given the religious ties the family has, many have accused him of hypocrisy and created a lot of controversy. But beyond the extravagance, the royal family is no stranger to internal conflicts. I mean, stories of missing princes and forced abductions have raised pretty serious questions about what really happens behind palace walls. Saudi Arabia has always denied abducting dissident royals, but the list of missing princes suggests otherwise. There are several reports about those who have criticized the ruling family and have occasionally disappeared from the public view. Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses goes beyond political kidnappings, with strict laws like male guardianship systems that treat women as weak citizens, although there has been some improvement on this front recently. But let's take a moment to go back to the country's beginnings for a bit, because remember how I said that Standard Oil and therefore the US were heavily invested in Saudi? Well, after the discovery of oil in 1938, it turns out that tension had built up between the US and Saudi Arabia that just couldn't be bottled up for long. As I mentioned earlier, the landmark agreement had been signed, giving rise to the American-owned Aramco company. Now, this was basically a concession agreement between the Saudi government and the Rockefeller-backed Standard Oil Company of California that was signed way back in 1933. But behind the scenes, tensions were rising. Traditional Saudis were worried about foreign influence, while Americans felt like outsiders in an unfamiliar land. The partnership was profitable, but far from friendly. With the value of this deal growing, Washington had one priority: keeping the oil flowing and keeping the right people in power. And this meant propping up the Saudi royal family and crushing anything that threatened it. So no unions, no national uprisings, social movements, and not even a mention of democracy. I mean, in places like Iran and Egypt, the direction of oil had already been decided, where the leaders tried to take control of their own resources. So that's nationalization. But the US was determined to stop this from happening in Saudi Arabia. This partnership might have made Saudi Arabia richer, but it didn't really fix all of King Ibn Saud's problems. No doubt money was flowing in, but it just wasn't fast enough. I mean, running a kingdom was expensive. His lavish lifestyle, public projects, and government expenses steadily drained his treasury. But he looked to the oil company for more money, but Aramco resisted. The company argued that its contracts were fixed, its costs were rising, and any sudden demands could disrupt operations. Simply put, they weren't willing to hand over any more cash without a fight. So he found another way. His finance minister, Abdullah Suleiman, quietly brought in a US tax expert, John Greene. Now, the goal was to find a way to take a larger share of Aramco's profits. In November, Ibn Saud acted decisively. A new income tax decree appeared suddenly. Half of Aramco's profits would now belong to the Saudi government. The law also vaguely hinted that an even bigger share could be taken later. Aramco pushed back, saying that their 1933 agreement didn't mention anything like this. But Ibn Saud wasn't debating. For 2 months, the company's executive vice president Davis went back and forth with King Abdullah. They pushed, pleaded, and pointed to their 1933 agreement. This new tax decree broke the deal, they complained, but Abdullah wasn't having it. He listened and waved off their concerns, saying that even the richest nations raised taxes when they needed to. They pointed out that the US did it all the time, so why should Saudi Arabia be any different? And then he said something that left Davis with very little room to argue. Standard Oil Company, which was one of Aramco's own owner, had agreed to a 50-50 profit split with Venezuela, and that happened 5 years earlier. If they could do that with Venezuela, then why couldn't they do the same with Saudi Arabia? I mean, Davis knew that he had very little choice. The pressure had been mounting for months, and he couldn't afford to let negotiations drag on for any longer. So he decided a clear offer, a straight 50-50 profit split, but he made sure to secure something in return. First, Abdullah promised to appear on paper with this deal and would settle things once and for all. No more sudden demands and no more last surprises. Second, Aramco would not be forced to pay entirely in US dollars and sterling anymore. Instead, they could pay Saudi Arabia in whatever currencies they earned from oil sales. For Davis, this was a pretty big win because now they could grow Aramco's businesses in Europe, especially in Italy and France. Their weak currencies made trade very difficult, but this deal made it easy. Almost all of Aramco's sales happened outside the US, so this small detail made a massive difference. It was a hard-fought deal, but Davis had finally carved out a path forward. It had also effectively transformed Ibn Saud from a beneficiary to an equal partner. As a result, his share of the profits surged to $90 million in 1950. This was a significant increase from only $60 million that he would have received under the old 34-cent per barrel royalty system. But the US had no intention of losing its grip on Saudi oil. In exchange for securing Saudi oil and preventing its nationalization, President Harry Truman's administration introduced the Golden Gimmick. This policy granted American oil companies a tax break equal to 50% of their oil sales. It was a move that protected corporate profits while keeping the US influence strong in the region. But this wasn't a one-time trick either. It became a strategy for the US. Whenever a country with valuable resources moved towards nationalization, the US stepped in. They offered financial incentives, imposed sanctions, and backed regime changes. They wanted to keep foreign access to those industries, and even today, those same tactics continue. Whether it's oil in the Middle East, lithium in South America, or rare earth metals in Africa, the approach remains the same. The US perfected its playbook for controlling global resources. But this was before any of the oil had been found in 1938. But that day finally arrived, and it changed the world. Despite the tense negotiations and the settled outcome, Saudi Arabia hadn't yet achieved all it wanted to. You see, the Saud family had been one step ahead all along. By the 1970s, Saudi Arabia had full control of its oil. But the question is, how did they pull this off? One policymaker famously declared the kingdom had become masters of our own commodity. No longer reliant on foreign operators, Saudi Arabia now owned and managed its massive oil industry. This shift literally transformed the country's economy and shaped the future of its people. So how did they manage to outplay the world's most powerful country? Saudi Arabia didn't take control of its oil in the way that others did. While Libya, Iraq, and Iran snatched American assets, the Saudis did something different. They did it without any sudden takeovers or messy conflicts. Instead, they negotiated very well. Step by step, they increased their stake in Aramco, starting with a 25% share increase in 73, 60% in 74, and by 1980, they owned it all, but on their terms. They call this gradual process of taking oil control participation and not nationalization. And it worked. They handled the negotiations with gradual increases in a way that the US actually stayed happy. From that moment on, oil became more than a resource for the country. It was a basis for its growing geopolitical power. But this geopolitical power started to grow in the 60s and the 70s. Building on their complete control, they managed to create an oil cartel that would be the puppet master of the world's oil supply and therefore the world's economy. You see, despite taking control of their own oil, the kind of power that Saudi Arabia gained as a result of this move was even bigger. You see, in the 1960s, Saudi Arabia joined forces with Venezuela, Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait to form OPEC, which was designed to control oil production and stabilize prices. It started using its vast reserves to influence supply and dictate global market trends. With OPEC, Saudi Arabia became the central figure in global oil politics. Look, many countries produce oil, but Saudi Arabia controls it. That's what makes it different. Saudi Arabia has two major advantages. First, it always keeps extra production capacity ready to go. If the market needs more oil, it delivers. Second, it has the flexibility to adjust production whenever prices start shifting too much. That's a level of control most countries can only dream of. Saudi Arabia had been the powerhouse of OPEC. From the start, it was the one taking a massive decision-making role. With the largest reserves and the highest production, it had the leverage to dictate prices, control supply, and keep the world hooked on its oil. When Saudi Arabia spoke, OPEC listened. And when OPEC acted, economies felt it. They even held a huge share of spare oil production capacity. In 2023, they racked up 35% of OPEC's crude oil output, which is more than double of what Iraq managed. When you consider that OPEC's oil made up 27% of the world's petroleum liquids that year, it really shows how dominant they are. Saudi Arabia's oil dominance is undisputed, it's clear. But you see, oil doesn't last forever. While they lead OPEC, they're also building themselves into an economic powerhouse. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund is experiencing rapid expansion. By 2030, it's expected to hit a staggering $2 trillion in assets. Eventually, it will go from the fifth to the second largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. The rise of this fund is a focus on direct investments, key sectors in Saudi Arabia, and sustainability, especially in renewables and green assets. They are betting big on the digital economy, and they're making moves that could change the global financial industries. And yet, despite its futuristic ambitions, Saudi Arabia's wealth remains anchored to another 50-year-old pact that it made with the US, one that turned oil into a golden chain binding the kingdom to the dollar. Even as the fund bets on AI and solar farms, its trillions still flow through a system forged in the 1970s when the Saudis traded oil sovereignty for economic control. For decades, the oil and the US dollar have been inseparable. Since the 1970s, nearly every oil deal had been done in dollars, and that only made America's currency stronger. This petrodollar system pretty much guarantees that Saudi Arabia and the US stays financially tied, whether they like it or not. The deal locked in a system that forged the modern world. The US got a steady oil supply, and Saudi Arabia got advanced weapons and military production. Every barrel sold was priced in US dollars. It forced countries to hold and trade in American currency, and in return, Saudi Arabia pumped billions of its profits back into the US banks and treasury bonds. This was the foundation of the petrodollar system. For decades, it kept the US dollar king and the House of Saud untouchable. But the US wasn't the only one eyeing Saudi Arabia's deep pockets. As Gordon S. Brown, a former US diplomat, put it, everyone in the US, France, Britain, Japan were trying to get their fingers in Saudi's pockets. And he wasn't exaggerating. I mean, billions of dollars were at stake and every major power wanted a cut. But in the end, it was the US that walked away with the most lucrative deal of all. The relationship between these allies hasn't always been harmonious, but it has been mutually beneficial. But remember that I mentioned Khashoggi at the beginning of this video? Well, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi brought tensions to an all-time high. In the aftermath of the murder, Mohammed bin Salman realized that he had a problem. He publicly denied any involvement with the journalist's murder, but the public outrage was building up, and becoming diplomatic pariahs were not in the Saudi government's plan. Mohammed bin Salman knew that they had to change their image. The first step was a confession. Well, sort of. The Saudi government said that they had carried out their own investigation and they found out that Khashoggi had indeed died, but during a fight. There are reports that several people were sentenced for this crime by the Saudis, but the truth went far beyond that when they were investigated by the UN. Now, since then, the focus has been on improving the kingdom's reputation, with their sovereign wealth fund taking over soccer clubs and even professional golf, and continued progress on the Neom project. And yet, controversy is never far away. Despite trillions of dollars being poured into infrastructure and entertainment, the real cost of all of this is human. Laborers work in brutal and exploitative conditions, and the poor and migrants continue to pay the price for the country's ambition. All the while, the kingdom has regional conflicts in Yemen, tensions with Iran and Qatar, as it looks to expand its influence further. For over a century, the House of Saud had defied all odds. From tribal wars to oil negotiations, they've outmaneuvered rivals for centuries. And who would have thought that the Rockefellers' name would come out so much in a video about the Saudis? You see, the House of Saud built a kingdom and a system that kept them in control. Even as the world shifts away from oil, they're diversifying, they're making deals, and they're securing their future. They're innovating for the future. As long as the world needs oil, their influence will remain unshaken. But what happens when the oil runs out? It seems that the House of Saud is taking a strategic view of their future and diversifying, but will it really be enough? I guess only time will tell. Look, if you've made it this far into the video, please do leave a petrol or a gas emoji in the comments like this. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you haven't already, check out my deep dive video on the Rockefellers, because it has some links with this video and I think you'll really enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.